Welcome to Inside Brussels, the European Conservatives' monthly news show, where we discuss topics of special importance from the very heart of the European Union. Perhaps nothing is more important in Brussels this year than the coming European Parliamentary elections, now just 2 months away. This June, over 400 million people across the continent will have a chance to have their voices heard about what kind of Europe they would like to see in the next 5 years. Historically, EU elections have much lower turnout than national ones. The reason is that EU politics often feel distant and obscure to Europeans with little bearing on their life. This could be hardly further from the truth. EU policies are shaping everything around us, and Brussels have been gradually turning into Europe's primary political battlefield. The steadily increasing centralization of the EU means that member states have less and less say in shaping their individual paths. From border control to climate policies, national interests often have to be submitted to the will of the majority. Out of the 3 main EU institutions, only the members of the European Parliament are elected directly. The Parliament's role in shaping our policies is not insignificant. It not only has the power to approve or reject the Commission's proposals, but also to modify each law and propose its own. With MEPs having a say in every decision that comes out of Brussels, it does matter who represents you in the European Parliament. While looking at polls, we see a major right-wing surge ahead of the 2024 elections, tilting the balance of power in the Parliament that's currently dominated by the left. There could be many reasons for this populist revolt that we will get to in a moment, but so much is clear that Europeans have had enough of being told what's good for them by the bureaucratic and increasingly disconnected Brussels elite. This realization alone may very well make this year's EU election the most important so far. For this episode, we invited an MEP from both national conservative parties, the European Conservative and Reformist Group and the Identity and Democracy Group, to discuss the extent and impact of this right-wing shift and what will the EU look like in the next 5 years. We also extended our invitation to the centre-right European People's Party, but no representative of the EPP wished to take part. Our first guest representing the ECR Group is Lars Patrick Berg, who has been serving as an MEP since 2019. First, let us evaluate the past 5 years. What were the ECR's main priorities, and do you feel that it managed to succeed in a sense that it took account and represented conservative interests alone or together with the ID group, despite the leftist majority that dominates the European Parliament?
Well, first of all, I think I would like to highlight that this mandate since 2019 hasn't been a normal mandate due to COVID and due to other crises. So unfortunately, like in all our societies, we lost a lot of time to focus on conservative and really important political issues like migration, identity, national identity, housing, inflation, etc. And coming back to your question, I think ECR Group has done a very good job to impose incentives or initiatives, political initiatives in this House against the far left to highlight what is important in regards to national identity and overall policy issues.
There are some, when you mention these topics, there are some very interesting areas, very important areas that are important for voters, like migration, the green transition, and the EU's agenda is pretty clear for the next 5 years when it comes to these issues. The Commission plans to implement the Migration Pact and accelerate the Green Deal with the green transition with new climate goals, and prepare for Ukraine's EU accession with treaty change proposals that are quite obscure. So what would you say are the main priorities? What are the issues that are at stake for this election?
Well, I think Look, the mainstream parties here in the European Parliament and political groups, the left, the liberals, the socialists, and even the EPP group that has denied ECR and partly ID a fair representation in the committees and other parts of this House of the European Parliament, they have never listened to the electorate. And I think the most important issues are, first of all, that the European Commission won't take over sovereignty of the national states. This is very important. The member states need to be entitled and need to be empowered to keep their share and their take on defense, foreign relations, and other very important issues, and they can't be transferred to Brussels. Secondly, migration. It's a huge and it is a very important issue that troubles and a lot of the part of the electorate in Europe. So this hasn't been addressed by the liberals and left-wing majority or even EPP in this House. Plus, keeping the member states in the European Union a prosperous economic and powerful institution and organization. This is very important because people are afraid of losing their jobs about inflation, housing, etc. So all these issues haven't been addressed by the left or the left-wing liberals. And this is very important to address it. And we address it as ECR and partly ID.
Yes, we need a more stronger right in the parliament, and as the projections say that the ECR awaits a significant growth, of course much depends on the potential new members joining after the election. So how do you think what are the realistic expectations for ECR after the 2024 elections? How will the hemicycle look like?
Well, I'm quite optimistic that ECR will gain more seats because throughout Europe, not only in Germany, the member state I come from, but throughout Europe, there's a tendency to vote for parties and political movements that are addressing the most pressing and most important issues, not issues like that address wokeness and changing our societies, having no national identity, but housing, migration, inflation, defense, foreign relations. And I think ECR, I'm quite positive about that ECR will gain more mandates, partly maybe even ID will gain more mandates. And then it is a question, are there any fields of joint cooperation? Nevertheless, I think it's very important for ECR then to keep, to be open for opportunities with maybe EPP group, with more right-wing movements and parties in EPP group to change the overall movement of parties in this place to a more pragmatic and right-wing and realistic approach.
Now moving on to the next party, we have the ID Group's Vice President, Gunnar Beck. Originally an academic and lawyer specializing on EU law, Mr. Beck has been serving as an MEP since 2019. These past 5 years were not easy for the ID Group, as it is the only party in Brussels that operates under a de facto cordon sanitaire imposed by the leftist majority, despite a clear democratic mandate. What's the reason for this exclusion, and how did it affect you in this last term?
Well, life's never easy for members of the ID Group inside or outside the European Parliament. But in relation to your question, well, I think there are formal aspects to the cordon sanitaire, namely we are not given a vice president in the plenary, we don't receive a committee chair or two, and we've not got any vice chairs in the committees. So these are formal restrictions. I think they restrict I think, access to information to some extent. Nonetheless, they are largely formal. Then more substantively, it means that our members are rarely, if ever, given the chance of writing a report where they are. These are either insignificant reports, to be frank, or the reports are often amended beyond all recognition, so that more often than not, our members were had to withdraw their name underneath a report. So these are the main consequences of being beyond the pale, as the Irish would say, namely imprisoned behind the cordon sanitaire. But I think in other respects, it's not significantly hampered our work. Obviously, we can freely express our opinion on most things, but we are restricted when it comes to formal participation in the democratic process. And I think your comment was perfectly apt. There's no democratic justification for this, because we've been elected just like everyone else. Our voice should be heard. If we are then outvoted, fair enough, but not to be given a hearing, not to be given a voice, not to be given a role in the legislative process is against the spirit of democracy. But of course, here they say, well, by majority that was decided. It's a good example that by majority rule, even democratic principles can be subverted.
The polls predict a massive surge for ID2 in the coming elections, driven mostly by voters of the German AfD and the French National Rally. Why are Europeans abandoning the mainstream and turning to populists in such numbers?
Well, you've been very generous calling it a massive surge. I'd say a significant increase, and more so, I think, in France than in Germany. But you're right. We expect to increase our share of the votes, and to an even greater extent, that's true of our allies in the Rassemblement National. Why is this happening? I think the answer is very simple. For about at least a decade and a half, if not longer, at least since the great financial crisis, Western governments, and it applies to the United States just as much as to Western Europe, have been conceiving and forcing through policies that are not supported by broad segments of their populations. They've been pushed through not by referenda and clear democratic mandates, but because basically there's an oligopoly of established parties that all want the same thing and are pursuing the same policies. And I think popular protests and our projected increase in the vote in the forthcoming European elections reflect this. People are dissatisfied with the policies that have been forced upon them by manipulating the election and legislative process, and they're voting for our parties because we represent the only segment of the only set of political parties that are willing to articulate the fundamentally undemocratic nature of the policies that have been pursued over at least 1.5 decades. And just to give you a few examples, that's true of mass migration. We've seen several polls EU-wide which show that up to about 80 to 85% of the population throughout Europe is opposed to open door, uncontrolled, unqualified mass migration from outside Europe. Nonetheless, it's happening, and the EU has just adopted a new migration pact that will vastly increase mass migration into Europe. It's even proposed to abandon the notion illegal migration and to call it rather euphemistically irregular migration. That's one example. Then obviously the reaction to the financial crisis is another. And so is the green transformation. All these policies have made poor people even poorer. And I think people are beginning to feel this. And the latest example of this was the sanctions policy vis-a-vis Russia and the whole energy agenda of the European Union, which is designed to replace cheap and reliable sources of energy with new experimental so-called green sources of energy, which are vastly more expensive.
With a much stronger democratic mandate possibly being the third largest group in the European Parliament, what's next for the ID group in the coming years? Will it be able to break free of its cordon sanitaire and become a decisive voice in EU politics as much as it should be?
Will it? That's a key question. It will depend on at least two factors. One is the degree of our success in the elections. Of course, the stronger we get, the more difficult it will be to exclude us. Presently in Germany, we are polling at around, 18 to 20%. That's enough for the government, apparently, to consider outlawing the whole party. I don't think it will happen. But I think, to be fair, and that's an interesting, I suppose, comment from a patriot or nationalist, I don't think that the European electoral process is quite as bad as Germany. Therefore, I think once you reach that sort of level, it'd be very difficult for anyone to exclude a whole group from the European Parliament. The question is whether we get close to that level. In some countries, undoubtedly, in France, we easily exceeded. But I think the strength, the degree of our advance will be crucial. That's one aspect. The second aspect will be the development of opinion in some of the other groups. Well, the Greens are fanatics. There will be no evolution or change of views there. But let's take the EPP. A lot of the MEPs in the EPP are basically moderately conservative, sensible people who wouldn't by inclination support something like Mrs. von der Leyen's mass migration or green agenda. But they've been pushed in that direction, in particular by the CDU. So much will depend on whether the more conservative forces in the EPP, which essentially desire things we are desiring, whether they would become a bit more outspoken in articulating their opposition to what are essentially green policies that have been implemented by Mrs. von der Leyen over the last 5 years. If that rebellious spirit in the EPP is rising, then I think it'd be far more difficult for the other parties to exclude us. In any event, we've already broken the cordon sanitaire on some issues in the legislative process. Some of the most extreme green measures failed thanks to informal cooperation between us, the ECR, and segments of the EPP. If that continues, I think that would also ultimately help us to abandon or to break the cordon sanitaire. But for that, I think we've got to increase the number of our mandates by a good third or a quarter. So that's a crucial question.
Stay tuned, because we'll be back soon with our last guest, Ms. Ellen Fantini, the European Conservatives Managing Editor. As someone from outside of party politics, but still within the Brussels bubble, what signs do you see that indicate a potential right-wing shift?
Well, I think your two previous guests touched on this, but the right-wing shift, I think, is in the air. There's a sense of ordinary Europeans are simply fed up. They're fed up with Green Deal policies, migration policies, and I think more than that, they're tired of being told that they're wrong, that they're stupid, that they're xenophobic, and that their ideas don't matter. They're looking at parties and positions and saying, what looks like me? What are the policies that would make my home a home? What are the policies that will keep me warm in the winter? So you have the public sentiment. You've seen this in the farmer protests. Public sentiment is simply rising together to say enough. And although this is nothing new, I think we've always seen two Europes, the Europe of Brussels elites and the Europe of people who hope that Brussels will just stay out of their business. And that second Europe is finally speaking up.
The European Conservative, I've heard, is preparing a special print edition, an election guide.
Yes.
Could you tell me a bit about the project and the importance of it?
Sure. So we think the European Conservatives' Guide to the Elections is essential reading in the exciting few months before the elections. There's a lot at stake. And most of the, let's say, mainstream election guides, pundits, experts will tell the voters what Brussels wants them to know so that they vote in the proper way. And the European Conservative wants voters to think for themselves. And they deserve to be able to read about the issues from a right-wing point of view, emphasizing populist policies, emphasizing patriotism, nationalism, emphasizing sovereignty, that member states should be able to decide their own policies relating to their borders and other kinds of policies. So we're putting together this guide. It'll be out very soon. It includes analyses. It includes interviews with a number of MEPs and experts on various topics. And it helps to tell people the right way to approach the elections.
The European Conservative opened its Brussels office last January. As managing editor, how would you evaluate your time here so far? And could you tell me what the future brings?
Sure. Well, it's been a whirlwind for the European Conservative to have our office here in Brussels, to enter the lion's den, as readers of our weekly newsletter may recognize. It's this sense of being in Brussels, but not of Brussels. So we've gotten to know how everything works. We've gotten to know so many people. We've really had a warm reception. I think it's very clear that a conservative media voice was really missing in this city. So we have, of course, daily news. We have a weekly newsletter that is fantastic. We recommend everyone read it, even if you're not in the bubble. We have also a weekly podcast, current affairs podcast. We have, of course, this television show. We have events here in Brussels, both political and cultural. They've been fantastically well received. And of course, we have our quarterly journal, because of course, the fact is that politics means nothing if you don't have a culture to preserve. And we believe that the good, the true, the beautiful should be foremost in everyone's minds, because life is not politics. Life is something much far beyond that. So we hope we inject a little bit of that into the bureaucratic bubble.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
Thank you.